Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Katie Novak, and I am so excited to share with you the power and promise of universal design for learning to be more inclusive of all students in your schools in Lithuania. Now, previously, many students who have disabilities and support needs are educated in separate schools. And beginning in 2024, we're going to welcome students back to their neighborhood schools, and we want to ensure that they have access to learning with their peers, opportunities to learn at high levels, and the supports that they need so that they feel as though they belong. Now, there is a pedagogical framework that will allow us as schools and educators to shift our practices to be more inclusive. And today we're going to be talking about why that is important, how we're going to make those shifts. And then after this presentation, you're going to spend more time talking about the UDL guidelines for implementation in your schools in Lithuania. So let's dive in and kind of think about what we're going to be talking about in this keynote today. Now, our objectives, first of all, are to understand all of the different components that we have to consider to make this very, very big and important change. So we're going to talk a little bit about complex change theory. Once we have a better understanding of complex change theory, we're going to dive into what universal design for learning is and what are some of the core beliefs that drive our practice as UDL practitioners. And then we're going to talk about all of the system shifts that will be necessary to truly ensure that teachers are prepared and that schools have the resources they need to serve very diverse learners. So as we think about this work, let's start off by talking about complex change and the fact that many of these shifts will be difficult. Why? Because all change is difficult. Now, in the 1940s, there was this gentleman, Kurt Lewin, who talked about the science of change and how what ends up happening as human beings is we get a little bit frozen or a little bit stuck in our ways. And we have to change those ways to actually move forward and do something differently. The problem is that change is painful, that we have to let go of some of those beliefs or some of those practices that we were frozen in order to move on. And in some ways, that means recognizing that what we were doing was not the most effective thing. It was not the best way to serve students. And that's really hard. Now, if you've been in education for a long time, you can probably think back to some things that you did when you were first in a classroom or in a school, and you want to go and apologize to the students whom you used to serve because you've grown so much since then. But when we're first faced with change, we have to realize that what we're doing is not necessarily the best way to serve our students. And when we are trying so hard to serve our students, that is a difficult thing to acknowledge. And so we go through this process and we change, and then we get frozen again. We don't want to be frozen again. We want to be open to always changing because we have to use the practices that best meet the needs of the students who we serve. And they're always changing too. So how do you know if you're frozen or if you're in a school that's frozen? You're going to hear comments that are similar to some of the things you see here on this slide. People will say, well, we've never done it this way before. This is the way we've always done it. Or maybe they're going to look at the contract and say, well, this is not what my job is. This was not what I was supposed to be doing. Or people are upset and surprised because changes are happening. So if you're hearing things like that, what you're recognizing is that people are frozen in their beliefs. And something that we can do to really help people get through that is just to help them realize we have all changed before. We need to accept that change is difficult, that change is hard, but that we're going to get through this together because this is the best thing for kids. We know why it's important to be inclusive. Sometimes people struggle with how they're going to change their own practice, but we know that that is possible. So as we think about this change, what are all the different components that we have to consider if we're going to have this successful change process? Now, I want you to look at the visual here and notice some of the emotions or some of the results when we are missing a piece of this puzzle or a component of complex change. That all of this work starts with a vision. We have to have a vision for inclusive classrooms, and everybody has to understand that vision and what we're trying to do. We want to make sure that students get to be exactly who they are, and they're going to be successful with their peers because we're going to make sure that they have the conditions they need to be successful. And that vision has to be really clear to everybody that in the same classroom, we're going to have students who have needs for acceleration and challenge. We're going to have students who have really significant needs for support. And that support might be academic. It might be behavioral. It might be social or emotional or linguistic, but they're all going to be together. Now, if people don't know that's where you're headed as a country, as a school, they're going to be really confused why you're talking about universal design for learning, because they have to recognize that there is a vision for change. Now, let's say everybody does understand that. They do see that this is coming, but they don't know how to do it yet. They don't have the skill set yet to design something that works for students who are in very different places. Of course, people are going to feel really anxious. So you want to have a plan for professional development or professional learning to make sure that not only do people understand the changes that are going to happen, the vision for the future, but they have to understand what are the skill sets they need to build so that they can universally design a classroom. And we have to provide ongoing professional development through coaching, through workshops, through planning together so that people feel really confident in doing that. Now, what is the incentive for change? The incentive for change is that this is going to be better for students, that students are going to learn at much higher levels, that they're going to be more engaged, that they're going to feel more independent about their learning. And if I don't believe that this is going to be valuable for students, then I might be very resistant. So something that you can do here is to have people who are very willing and excited about these changes, to have them be early adopters. Get a small group of people who are doing this early, who experience success, and then they can help to incentivize colleagues. They can say, I understand the vision and I have built this skill set. I know how to universally design. And students are learning so much. My class is so engaged. They're helping me to come up with some options and choices that will incentivize others. So they're excited about the change because they know through vicarious experience that this is possible. Now, what if you have the skill set? What if you really do feel excited about implementing universal design, but you don't have the resources that you need? You don't have access to technology. You don't have access to time for planning. Maybe you don't have access to really great instructional materials. You're going to be really frustrated about this. You're going to say, I want to do this. I understand how to do this. I know how to do it, but I don't have what I need to serve all students yet. And because those things take a while, we need a plan. So now in 2023, start planning for welcoming students back. Start thinking about professional development. Start thinking about having early adopters, and make sure that we are going to have the resources that we need to be more flexible. So that right there is a model for complex change. And when we can put all of those things in place, we can help people get unstuck or unfrozen so that they can better serve all students. So just think about that first, that this is going to require a very clear vision. It's going to require us to build a skill set, have access to resources, work together, and we're going to need a plan to do that so that we can experience success. So the next component is, what is universal design for learning? What is this skill set that we are being called to build so that we can serve all of our students? Now, you're going to learn a little bit more about UDL guidelines and their relationship to the work that you're doing in Lithuania. However, let's start with, what is universal design for learning and what beliefs are we building upon? Now, what's really important here is understanding these three things. The first thing is that we have to embrace student variability. I'm going to talk a little bit about what variability is and how there's two different types of variability. There's interpersonal variability, which means that we are different from each other. But there's also intrapersonal variability, which means that I am different all the time, depending on the time of day, depending on what mood I'm in, depending who I'm working with. And so interpersonal variability helps us to understand that we are unique and different from each other. And intrapersonal variability helps us to recognize that we are dynamic and always changing. Now, traditional education understood that there was variability between students, and we often separated them based on that variability because we made an assumption that if we separated students based on their group, we could then give them what they needed. The problem with that is that their needs are always changing. So if you were to think about all of your learners, you might realize that some of your learners are reading below grade level expectations. You have other students who are reading at grade level, and then you have students who are reading significantly above grade level. And what we often have done historically is separated them into different groups. And the students who really struggle to read, we might give them an audiobook, or we might read aloud to them. Now, that might be a really necessary scaffold so that students can have access to a text. But let's say that I am a strong reader. That is only true if I have my contact lenses in. It's only true if the text is in English. I only read in English. It is also only true if I don't have a really bad headache or if the room isn't really loud. And so when we're in a classroom that is universally designed, when we recognize that there is a need for some students, we provide it as an option to all students. So in an inclusive classroom, we would have students who are reading at grade level, below grade level, above grade level. And so if we have a text that is very important for all students to read, we could say, we want all of you to be able to understand this text. So think about how you're doing today and think about the best way for you to get information from this text. Would you like a printed copy that you could read? Would you like to access it on a digital technology like a laptop or an iPad so that it could be read aloud? Or would you like to get in a small group and have somebody read it? And then ask students, what do you feel like you need today and why? And even though I'm a really strong reader, I might say, actually, I have a terrible headache today. I would love to listen to the text. So that embraces intrapersonal variability. When we know that there is something that some students need, we provide that as an option to everyone. Now, that being said, that doesn't just mean that we have a lot of options and choices all the time. We want to be really strategic about the options and choices we provide because we know that all students should have the opportunity to work toward the same firm goals. So we have to think about, what is it that we want all of our students to know? And what is it that we want all of our students to do? And based on variability, what barriers might I predict? would prevent students from being able to do that? And what options and choices could I provide so that every student would have opportunities to work towards that goal? So we want to be really thoughtful about the types of flexibility we provide. And if our goal is that students will explain what they've learned about the solar system or the stars, we might provide them with options to explain in writing, to explain by giving a class presentation, to explain by making a children's book or recording a video. That all makes perfect sense. But if the firm goal is to produce writing, every student has to produce writing. So I can't say, oh, you have an option to tell the class, because that wouldn't allow a student to write. But I do know that there are lots of barriers that prevent students from writing well. Sometimes students don't know how to organize their writing. So I provide optional graphic organizers or sentence stems to prompt them. Sometimes I know that students struggle with the fine motor skills, so I allow them to use voice to text or keyboard. Sometimes students need some feedback before they can write, so I give them options to have peer review or have a conference. So what you're learning here is based on variability. We have options and choices, but those options and choices are always going to be tied to very firm goals because we don't want to lower expectations. We just want to increase scaffolding and support. Now, lastly, we can't figure out what students need when they're always changing. We can predict what some of the barriers are going to be, but I want students to be better at making choices for themselves. So with UDL, we value expert learning, which is students making choices independently so that they can reflect and make choices and move towards goals in a way that works best for them. So again, as a practitioner, you're going to think about what is it that all students have to know and do? What might prevent students from being able to do that? Are there options and choices I can provide to students by saying, this is the goal, which of these works best for you? What do you want to choose today and why? And how do I help students to build ownership of that learning? Now, what you're probably hearing as I'm talking through this is the skill set to recognize barriers, maybe the resources of having technology available. That goes back to that complex change that we were talking about at the beginning. So let me give you an analogy to help all of this come together. I want to talk about a dinner party, and I want to have you make connections to what we've talked about with variability, firm goals, and then expert learning. So imagine that all of you are going to come to my place for dinner. I've set the table beautifully. My firm goal is that you have a delicious, delicious dinner that makes you feel at home. I want you to come to my house and I want you to be able to eat what I create, and I want you to feel like you belong there. Now, imagine for a minute that while you come here, I make my grandmother's favorite dish. This is called tuna noodle casserole. It is some pasta, as you can see, and there's some vegetables that come out of a can usually, and some tuna fish, and there's some sauce. And if I served this to everyone, I know for sure that you can't all eat this. Before meeting you, I know that some of you cannot or will not have this tuna noodle casserole. So if this is all I served, I wouldn't include all of you. Some of you would have to eat somewhere else. And the same is true of our students, that many students have had to have their education somewhere else because what we were doing in our classrooms was one size fits all. Everyone was expected to learn in the same way and share their learning in the same way. And some students simply could not access it in that way. And so we had to have kind of a different place. Now, again, I don't know any of you. And I know that some of you have lactose intolerance and aren't going to have the dairy because it's a cream-based sauce. Some of you are vegetarian or vegan and would not want to have tuna fish or seafood. Some of you might say, goodness gracious, that is not anything that we eat here in Lithuania. And I don't feel like you've thought about me when you created that dish. And so what you're learning here is that it's not that I made tuna noodle casserole that is the problem. It's that there are no other options. And if I don't embrace your variability and provide you with options, some of you are going to be excluded. So the skill is going to be to learn more about you and what you love. It's going to be to recognize that there are barriers and one size fits all. And it's hard because I might say, but I always make tuna noodle casserole for my parties, right? I make it frozen, that's what I need to do. But I have to recognize that if my vision is including all of you, I can't only make tuna noodle casserole anymore. Instead, I have to start thinking about what really is my goal and can I create a buffet? And I don't have to do this all by myself. We can create this buffet together. Here in the United States, where I am from, we sometimes call it a potluck dinner, that everybody brings their own pot and you put it all together family style and you share. And in our classrooms, we can work with students to create a potluck or a buffet by saying to them, this is the goal. This is what all of you have to know and do. Do you have any ideas of some other ways that we could do this? And we have to be really clear that we're not lowering our expectations, but all of you can have a really beautiful meal without having to have tuna noodle casserole. So Universal Design for Learning is all about recognizing the barriers when we do not provide options and choices, and then thinking about what options and choices would be necessary to include every single learner. And then through this process of making choices and reflecting on those choices and working with our learners and with each other, we can begin to create something that works better for everyone. So what I want to do right now is just share a little bit about my own daughter and how amazing my daughter is and how she really is incredibly successful in an inclusive classroom, but would not be if there were no options and choices. So my daughter has significant support needs. She does have disabilities, and she has something that's called ADHD, which is attention hyperactivity disorder. She also has dyslexia. And a lot of people would think that she should be in a special classroom or in a special school because she is reading significantly below grade level. And she has a very, very difficult time and lots of challenges kind of sitting still in a classroom and being compliant. And so if the classroom requires her to pick up hard copies of printed texts and requires her to sit still the entire classroom, she's not going to do very well there. And sometimes we say, well, she'd be better off somewhere else. But I don't think that's true because she has so much to teach her classmates. Having her in the classroom is amazing. Now she's going to need the option to listen to text a lot, and she'll need scaffolds like graphic organizers and opportunities to revise work. And even just the simple option of being able to stand in the back of the room and use fidget tools allows her to be really successful. So I want to tell you my favorite story about her, which is the punchline of the story is this quote here, which is that my daughter is amazing. She's amazing. And I want everyone in the world to know her. And I want her classmates to know her because she adds so much to a classroom. And when she was little, she was probably about 7 or 8 years old, we were going for a walk. And while we were on this walk, we saw a squirrel, this little rodent, get hit by a car. And as a mom, I was trying to like get my kids away. Like, come on, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. This is bad. This is bad. And she's like, I'm not leaving it. Like, what do you mean you're not leaving it? What are we going to do with this squirrel? It's dying. It's very sad. If you've ever seen an animal get hurt, like it's very difficult to watch. And she went up to that little squirrel and she picked it up and she held it in her arms. And within moments, that squirrel like took a breath and died in her arms. And she looked at me and she said, "Nothing should ever die alone." And when I think about inclusion, I think about not only how much she benefits from having the support she needs, but how much other students benefit from her strengths. And also how important it is that all of the students get the same options and choices so that they can become more independent and really learn to advocate for what they need to be successful. And when we separate students and believe that we can give them what they need, they become very dependent on adults to give them what they need. And what I have always loved about my daughter, I have 4 kids, 3 sons and 1 daughter, is she's always been very, very independent. Like, I'm going to go in and save that squirrel. I'm going to make choices that will allow me to do well in school. But in many spaces in the world, she would be excluded and then just constantly given the audio and given the extra support. And what's so beautiful is she has opportunities to ask for that. And the more that we can build expert learners, the more efficient this is going to be in the long run, because we're going to have students who, when they're posed with a question about, would you rather learn this way or would you rather learn this way, they're going to have the skill to reflect, to think about their strengths, to recognize what areas are that they need to get more support. And that's going to allow them to transfer this when they go into their careers or when they choose to go to college or when they go into the military. They're better thinkers. They're more independent. They're more self-directed. And that's what we need from our learners. Now, I've provided you with a number of different resources, and one of them is an ebook called Would You Rather? And this is a great spot to begin to think about just how simple and practical it is to provide choices to our learners when we recognize barriers. So, for example, if the expectation is that all students sit still and quiet in the whole class, and then we think about welcoming lots of students back who might have a very difficult time sitting still and being quiet, we might say we can provide an option for students to either sit quietly or have maybe a fidget that they use under their desk that's not going to be distracting, or maybe we provide options for students to stand. And what we would say to students is, I want all of you to be really engaged in today's lesson. And I know that some of you may struggle with keeping your body quiet in your seat. And the most important thing, the most important goal is that whatever you choose, you're not going to be disruptive to anybody else. But I want to make sure that you have what you need so that you can really focus. And for some of you, that means kind of sitting down. And for some of you, it might mean moving around a little bit in your seat. Like you can see, I'm bobbing around quite a bit here. Or you might want to stand, but we have to remember that we don't want to interrupt other people's learning. So what do you feel like you'd rather try today? And why do you think that might be good for you? And it's not making a decision to say, this is what I'm going to do every day, but it's saying, this I feel like is going to work for me right now. And there's so many practical ways that we can say, would you rather read this or would you rather listen to it? Would you rather share what you're learning in writing, or would you rather share what you're learning by recording your voice? And that's not always going to be relevant simply because we have to really think about what our goal is. But this will give you lots of ideas of places that you can start so that you can help students recognize their own variability. So you can start getting students used to making choices, knowing that if students make choices that do not serve their learning, you can provide them with feedback and redirect them. And belonging and access, that is what is important here. So what do we have to do to get ready to set this vision, to build this skill set, to make sure we have the necessary resources? This is where we have to think about creating a recipe for an action plan to move forward. And that requires us to recognize all the many different ingredients that are necessary to build an inclusive system that is built on this foundation of universal design for learning. And just as when we make a cake, we have lots of different ingredients, so too do we have to create lots of different ingredients to be able to universally design well. So there's a tool I shared with you that asks you to reflect on some of the ingredients that you have already that will allow you to build this skill set and include more students. And you can also begin to think about some of the things that you don't have yet, so that you can create an action plan over time to make sure that educators have what they need so that they can best serve all students in inclusive classrooms. So the last thing that I want you to think about here is how important it is to have all of these different drivers in a system. We need competency drivers to build the skill set of educators. We need to make sure that we have professional development. We might need instructional coaching. We need leaders to give really great feedback to educators. We also need a lot of implementation drivers, like access to technology, high quality instructional materials, and things like really great assessments that provide us with data so that we can determine which students are making really responsible choices and learning and which need to be redirected or who need more differentiated, targeted support. And lastly, we need really strong leadership who is able to allocate resources necessary, create this shared vision, and to build a culture where all teachers are working together and have this shared responsibility for all learners, because we can create classrooms where the conditions that all students need are options if we work together and we make sure that we're leveraging complex change theory. So you can learn more about competency drivers, implementation drivers, and leadership drivers by looking at the resources, specifically the picture of that cake. So the last thing that I would love for you to consider here is just what was in the cards for you today during this keynote. If I were to give you a deck of cards right now and you were to pull a heart, you would say, you know what? This felt affirming. I understand the vision. I'm excited about this work. I'm ready to make a plan. If you choose diamonds, you might say, I really like that point about all the pieces of complex change. Like that's going to be important. And I want to remember that because this is not going to be easy. We're not just going to say change. We have to like build in the capacity to change. We have to give people the resources. We have to incentivize that change. So you can see what your options are. So after I get paused or turned off, just choose one of those suits and reflect on this keynote. What did you learn and what do you feel? Maybe what is a new idea or what's something that you would like to dig into more? And just know that on the other side of this journey, I can tell you it is so worth it. Kids are capable of learning at high levels when they're together, and we can build classrooms that are more engaging and more inclusive and provide students with the opportunities to build the skills that they will need to be successful